Okay. So as I said before, we're going to continue our discussion of the first fundamental welfare theorem. And remember, this says that competitive markets are efficient. And okay.
Professor, did you take roll already?
No,
Oh.
actually, I'm not taking roll because tomorrow is the last drop date. So I normally take roll for the first 3 classes or whatever, and I don't do it after that.
Professor, I have another question. I'm extremely sorry. So I did my homework and the 2 discussions, but the third one, the one that was due last night by 11:59,
yeah,
I got the dates confused, so I didn't submit it. Would I be kicked from the class? Because I remember you said something.
No, yeah. So we can talk about that at the end, and just because I want to go ahead and move on with the lecture, but
Yes.
we should have a few minutes to chat at the end, okay? So so we really want to drill down into this idea of efficiency, and there are a lot of different ways of defining efficiency. But we'll start with this notion of general economic efficiency, which is the one that is most commonly used. And so general economic efficiency has these 2 components. The first one is allocative efficiency. And the second one, which I think is much easier to understand, is productive efficiency. Now, just to be clear, general economic efficiency implies both allocative and productive efficiency. So these are components of general economic efficiency. Allocative efficiency is the idea that every good goes to the consumer that values it most. Okay. And productive efficiency, every good is produced by the producer, and I'm going to put in firm just to make sure the language is a little bit clear, that produces for the least cost. Those are the general ideas. Now, I don't know. So let's chat just a little bit. So Alex Ortega, you're at the top of my list for participants right now. You here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Alex, you're here.
How are you doing this morning, Alex?
Pretty good.
Pretty good. So I don't know if any of this is unclear to you. Do you have any questions?
Nope, it's making sense so far.
Okay, but look at this part of what I define. So general economic efficiency means you have to be allocatively efficient and you have to be productively efficient, right? And then there's this part. Let's see if I can highlight it a little bit. Values it, right? So let's say I make some sort of claim, Alex. I say, listen, and I see some people in chat. Okay, good. And again, so it looks like you, Brian M, you're helping out with the chat stuff, answering questions. That's very good. You want to help me out, and you can monitor the chat for questions, Brian M.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, thanks. Anyway, so Alex, so values it the most. So I make this claim. I say, listen, we have a market economy. I'm going to say that our markets are efficient, and then I'm going to tell you, well, what's going on here is, you know, it's fine. And I also want to, you know, kind of be very careful with the language here. You know, we said that economics is the scientific study of resource allocation mechanisms. Do you remember that, Alex? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we said it's a science, right? And there are generally two types of claims that people can make. So one type of claim, and maybe I'll just write this over here on the side someplace. Claims are just, you know, propositions. It's what people say, right? So some are normative, and other ones are positive. Are you familiar with these ideas, normative and positive claims?
It's been a while.
What's that?
It's been a while since I've seen those terms, to be honest.
Okay, so just kind of get your head clear about this, because it's important. A positive claim is supposed to be measurable. It's supposed to be descriptive. It's supposed to be what you and I might think about as being like a scientific proposition. Like if I say something to you like acceleration due to gravity on Earth is 32 feet per second, that's like, can we disagree about that?
Probably not.
Well, we could, but what would we do if I'm like, no, Alex, it's 30 feet per second, and you're like, no, Dr. Hunter, it's 32 feet per second. How would we resolve that?
We could potentially go back to the formula or whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, we could go look it up on Wikipedia, or right. Hopefully the editors didn't mess with it, but also, right, there should be, I mean, we may not know how to do it because we're not physicists and we don't spend a lot of time measuring acceleration, right? But there's probably, like, we could kind of dream something up, right? Like, well, if acceleration due to gravity is 32 feet per second, like, we'll go to this bridge and we'll measure how high this bridge is. And then we should be able to make some sort of prediction about how long it takes this rock we drop off the bridge to hit the ground. And if you're right that it's faster, 32 feet per second, it should hit earlier than if I'm right, right? So we could like measure it, right? It's supposed to be something like, you know, I'm sitting at my dining room table right now, and my dining room table is about like, I guess like on one side, the long side, it's like 7.5 feet long, I'm guessing. I don't know, I haven't measured it. But if you came into my house, you're like, no, that's not 7.5 feet, that's only 6 feet, right? How do we resolve it? We get a tape measure. Yeah. And unless we disagree about the tape measure, I'm like, no, that tape measure is measuring things in centimeters. The numbers are going to be wrong, right? You know, I mean, there's potential ways we could disagree about the way that the instrument's measuring or about the measurement itself. But at the end of the day, as long as we're both reasonable people, right? We should be able to resolve this. It's a concrete claim about something that can be measured, right?
Mhm.
But a normative claim is based on, you might call them like values or opinions, right? About, the way a lot of people say that normative claims involve the word should. I don't know that that's exactly right, because if I look at, my daughter last night, she was, her major, her intended major is architecture. So right now she's taking these like art drawing classes that she's supposed to take for her major, and she was drawing this stuff on her, not on her desk, she was on her desk drawing on paper, but she's on her desk, she's drawing, and she said that her architecture professor asked her to draw a picture of loud, and it's supposed to be abstract, right? And then he also asked her to draw a picture of sour, right? That tastes sour. Now, that's a little bit different, right? She was trying to figure out, like, how do you draw sour? How would you draw sour, Alex?
How would I draw sour? Probably like a pop of like a green like explosion or something. I don't know.
Okay, yeah, right. And this is the discussion that she and I had too. She's like, Dad, how do I draw sour? And I was like, well, sour sounds kind of like a texture to me, like spiky. You were saying explosion, right? But you wouldn't normally, like, we might agree that, like, we wouldn't want to draw sour as like a smooth thing,
Probably
right?
not.
Yeah, like sour doesn't seem like it would be something smooth. But if we disagree about that, is there any real way to resolve it?
Not really. It's just a difference of opinion.
Yeah, if I say sour should be, jagged and spiky, and you say sour should be smooth, there's no, we can't measure that. We can't resolve it in a kind of a scientific way. It's really a matter of opinion at the end of the day. And so science is supposed to involve positive statements, things that are measurable, right? Now, when we talk about general economic efficiency, we're shortly going to say, oh, we've picked our measure, right? You could disagree whether or not the measure we're labeling with efficiency really is a good way of measuring efficiency. And there are lots of economists that debate about this kind of stuff. But given that we define the measure a certain way, I mean, it's like the difference between saying, like, we're going to measure distance in centimeters or meters versus inches and feet. We could talk about, like, which unit of measure is better, and that might be some normative discussion, right? You might, for certain reasons, prefer centimeters to inches, but once we agree on the measure, then we're off and running, right? And so here at the beginning, when we first start talking about efficiency, it's important for us, because I'm going to say, listen, this is how we measure value to consumers, right? And this is what the definition of efficiency is. But it's worth it. So once we've defined these like units with which we're measuring, then we can go on and we can begin our scientific inquiry. We can begin evaluating our hypotheses and make our positive statements. But at the beginning, it's it's worth doing a little bit of reflection about whether or not this stuff makes sense, because or makes sense in a general, like whether or not we find the definitions of the units persuasive, the way we're doing things persuasive. Now, if you don't find it persuasive, there's not much you can do about it because you're an economist and this is what economists do. But it might give you an idea for like how you could, advance the profession, propose something else, right? Again, like people deciding to switch from standard measures of feet and inches to centimeters and meters. You might be able to convince people to do that, or you might be able to convince people that the way that we're measuring value is inadequate somehow, right? That we ought not to do it that way. But that's going to be kind of an uphill battle, and you're just getting started in your profession as an economist. So you got time, but it might take a while to convince everybody that you got a better way of doing things. But we should explore at least a little bit, right? Remember that everybody in every society has to answer these three questions. I mentioned before the three, let's call them questions every society must answer. And I'll say they're the three economic questions, right? And I said they're what to produce, how to produce it, and who is going to get it, whatever it is. So the answer to these questions, what to produce, is going to be, well, the market's going to decide what to produce in a market economy. There's no alternative in the way that we're thinking about things. If the economy is a market economy, there's some sort of background information about you might have heard of these terms. Have you ever heard, Alex, the terms centralized versus decentralized
They sound familiar.
economy? You might also have heard a planned economy. And you might have also heard the terms we talked about a little bit before, like public versus private ownership. But so you said, well, they sound kind of familiar. So you want to tell me a little bit about, like, what is a centralized economy?
If I had to guess, I'd say it's termed pretty literally. It's probably the economy is focused, like the powers of the economy are probably focused in one place. Like it's not divvied up by many people and players.
Yeah. So it's like the government is like the central authority, right? And they decide, and they plan. The best example we have of this is the former Soviet Union, and they literally had a bureau that would construct these 5-year plans of like how many shoes to produce, what type of shoes to produce, how many cars to produce, what type of cars to produce. And then they would tell you, hey, Alex, guess what, comrade? You're going to go be a coal miner for the next 5 years because we need so much coal and we need more workers, right? So they would literally tell people what to do. And that's centralization at an extreme. So decentralization is more what we have here, right? So Alex, you decided you want to be an economist, right?
Yep.
Were you thinking about how many economists were needed in the economy?
Not quite, not really.
No, there's like a different sort of calculation, right? You were like, well, if I get a degree in econ, I might be able to get a good job doing something that I like. And then you just kind of figure that out on your own, I guess, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah. And so you can also have public ownership to the extreme and private ownership to the extreme. Here in the United States, I had mentioned before, about 2/3 of all of our resources are privately owned, and about 1/3 are owned by the government. And that's what we mean by public ownership. In a country like China, it's flipped the other direction, where it's more like 2/3 are publicly owned and 1/3 are privately owned. It doesn't really make sense these days, and I'll just say this in passing. It's not really kind of central to what we're talking about here, but if you're paying attention and you care about economics, you'll see these things come up from time to time. It's not really typical within economics these days to talk about things like communism and capitalism. Really, the reason why, do you have any idea, Alex, why economists don't really talk about communism and capitalism anymore?
I would assume probably because it's already been discussed to a great degree and it's arguably accepted a little bit more than it was before. It's a little bit less problematic potentially. I don't know.
Well, I think at least from what I understand in the profession and the people that I've been around, the reason why we don't talk about communism is because there are a lot of political things that have nothing to do with the economy that are also part of the idea of communism. And really, we want to focus on these resource allocation questions, right? So all of the like political baggage, these other ideas that don't have to do with resource allocation, we don't care about. They don't have to do with our discipline. And likewise, capitalism, as some sort of an ideology, again, it has a lot of political implications that we don't really care about. We just want to focus on this question of how do we move resources around the economy? How does it work? So those terms have fallen out of favor, and economists have decided to just focus on this issue of, are the resources owned publicly or are they owned privately? Is the economy centrally planned or decentrally planned? Are there lots of individuals that own their own resources? Like, for example, when we talked about labor, what's kind of the extreme of not owning your own labor? Well, that's like being a serf or a slave. That's where somebody tells you you have to do this kind of work, right? I don't even own my own time, my own labor. It's owned in the case of a communist government, you know, like by the public entity, they're telling me what to do. So here, kind of at a minimum, at least people own their own labor, right? So they have that kind of private ownership, and labor is a really, really important resource. And it's decentralized, meaning individuals, when they privately own stuff, they decide what to do on their own. And if we talk about public ownership, we don't have to talk about labor. We can talk about land resources like the national forest, and you know, the government decides how many trees in the national forest get to be used for forestry purposes, and you know, how to manage the forest. Or I don't know if you've been watching the news lately, Alex, but do you think the government's doing a good job of managing our forestry right now?
No clue.
Have you seen all the fires?
Not really. I don't pay attention to the news.
Oh, okay. Well, there are these huge wildfires going on in Northern California, you know, killing and destroying homes and all the rest of it. And a lot of people say it's because of the forestry management practices that have been put in place. But that would be an example of, you know, centralized planning, right? The government manages the forest. They're the ones deciding, you know, how many trees get used for timber and how many are there for other purposes. And anyway, the main point is just that there's this dichotomy. It's not communism versus capitalism. It's private ownership, which goes along with decentralized planning, and public ownership, which goes along with centralized planning. Okay, so do you have a question about that? Because I just want to be clear kind of where we're starting off in our study, because when we study markets, we're solidly in the decentralized planning, private ownership category. Are you okay with that, Alex?
Yep, makes sense.
Okay. So now we also have this claim up here that, okay, and this is where we get back to the positive and normative statements. Well, competitive markets are efficient. Is that a positive or a normative statement?
Probably, honestly, potentially a bit of both.
Yeah, it really is. It's a positive statement once we define efficiency. Once we agree that this is how we're going to measure the table, right? Once we agree that this is how we're going to measure efficiency, then we can either evaluate that claim as being true or false. We just go ahead and, this is a competitive market, we're going to measure it, and it either is or it isn't, right? And then it becomes a positive statement. But there's this implicit thing, and this is the part that I wanted to make sure that I put up in front and I emphasize, is that there's this normative claim kind of in the background that efficiency is desirable, that it's a good thing, right? That we should have an efficient economy. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Because implicitly, like, why are we measuring it if it doesn't matter? And why are we concerned with studying something that's unimportant, right? I mean, that's a, you know, I mean, there are lots of things we could do with our time, but again, this is the first fundamental welfare theorem, and if it's really so important, and it includes this notion of efficiency right up front, the foundation of our discipline, you know, there must be something about efficiency that implicitly is something worth studying, and that is, and I'm doing air quotes now, but it is like a good thing for society. Now, as we go on, I'm not gonna talk about this for the rest of the class very much, but because it is so important to our discipline, it's really worth it for you all to think about what's going on here, how efficiency is being measured, and why it's an important concept beyond our discipline. Because a lot of the things that you're going to hear in popular culture and in where economics crosses over with politics is going to center on this kind of debate, which is, should our economy be centrally planned? Should we emphasize private ownership? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? And fundamentally, economists have come down on the side of, well, we're interested in efficiency, and if competitive markets are going to get us to efficiency, then decentralized private ownership is really the way to go. And again, not every society has come down on that side of the debate, and you know, those are all good questions, and they're questions with nuanced and sort of complicated answers, and we end up finding those in our terms at the beginning if you pay attention to the terms that are vague and how we end up defining them. So if I say, and I'll go ahead and I'll talk to somebody else here just for a minute to kind of mix it up. So Cameron Reyes, you here? Cameron.
Yes,
How are you this morning?
I'm okay.
Oh, just okay, not better than that. It's a beautiful day. Anyway, you know why I'm happy, Cameron?
No.
No, other than the fact that I love econ, because I think we've hit the cool weather now. Is it cooled down where you are?
Yes, it's definitely not as hot as it was last week.
Yeah, so I'm happy for I think we hit cool weather. But I want to talk about this idea of allocative efficiency and that part of it that I said, you know, every good goes to the consumer that values it most, right? So implicitly, if we use competitive market, they're efficient, we're going to have general economic efficiency. That means we're going to have allocative efficiency, and the goods are going to go to the consumers that value them the most, right? Doesn't that sound nice? You know, that you could look out into our economy and say, oh, you know, my neighbor has that Tesla because he values it more than anybody else. Doesn't that sound nice, Cameron?
Yeah, it sounds ideal.
Right? I mean, it sounds good, but then when you get down to kind of like the nuts and the bolts of it, and you look around at, you know, I don't know if you're anybody that's prone to envy or not. I used to have a neighbor, and they had, I think it was like a Mercedes-Benz SUV, like a nice one, like a GLC 350 or something like that. And, you know, I was a little bit shocked. You know why?
Why?
Okay, because they took this very nice car and they lowered it so that it was about 3 inches above the ground, and they put these crazy rims on it, and like did all this stuff to and then they had a license plate, and you know what the license plate said? It said, "See you hating."
That's good.
Yeah, I thought it was. I mean, it's good that they were able to get that license plate right, because it was probably. But yeah, "See you hating." So, but so they're kind of like interested or worried or thinking about the idea of envy, right? Where you look at somebody else and you're like, they got something and I want it, and they shouldn't have it, and those kinds of feelings, right? So I don't know if you look out into the economy and you really do think, we're in a market economy, and my sister has her iPhone 12 Max Pro, and she has it because she values it more than anybody else in society. And I have the thing that I have because I'm thinking about the iPhone 12 Max Pro because my daughter just got one, and her sister has an older iPhone, and her younger sister was a little bit envious. But yeah, I don't know if so. Do you think that this is true, that all of the goods that are allocated to the market end up going to the consumers that value them the most? Is there something missing in that statement?
I feel like there's something missing, but I'm not sure what is missing.
Well, let's talk about other types of goods, right? So we're kind of talking about, cars and iPhones, but what about something like education, or something like healthcare, or something like housing, right? You see somebody down by the 55 freeway pushing a shopping cart, and you say, oh, they got that shopping cart because they value that shopping cart the most. And if they're homeless, they're living in that tent because they value that tent more than anybody else. But do they value a home that has 4 walls and a solid roof less than the people that have the homes? Or if somebody's sick and they need treatment, the people that are getting allocated the doctor's time, because this is goods and services. We say every good, but is it the people that don't go to the doctor? They don't go because they don't really value that service, so they don't get it. What do you think, Cameron?
I wouldn't say that they don't value it just because they don't use it a lot, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I guess so. So does anybody else have an opinion about this that they would like to share? Because there's one thing that I think would help put a little bit of meat on the bone and explain it, or at least the controversy. And it might have occurred to somebody else. Okay. So what about you, Madison?
I think that they don't have access to it, so they can't really value it.
Can you explain that? Like, is it different than iPhones? I mean, like, I don't know.
Well, like what you were saying with the iPhone, like not many people can afford like the newest item, so like they can't really. I mean, they might value it highly, but they just can't afford it.
Oh, so now you're getting really close, right? You ever play that game when you were a kid where like your parents, if they were play with you, like I play with my kids, or kids play like I used to play with my cousins where like one person would hide something and then the other person or other people would, they tell the other people like you're hot or you're cold.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're hot. You're like, you're burning up. You have almost have the idea. So what does it mean to value something highly, but not be able to afford it?
Is there like a word for it?
Well, no, I guess, it's a question, and it's one that economists don't know how to answer. Because how we have to be able to measure at the end of the day, in a concrete way, if we're going to use science. How do we? So there's not a special word. It's just kind of a question that is important, but sort of overlooked in our discipline, not because we intentionally look the other way. It's this that we really don't know. To say somebody really wants an iPhone and it's highly valuable to them, but they don't go out and buy one because they can't afford it. How do you differentiate between that and somebody who doesn't buy an iPhone because they don't want one? Like I can tell you, my older, she's my middle daughter, but the older of the two younger ones, went and got a new iPhone 12 Max Pro, right? And I was going to get a new phone at the same time, and I bought a new Android, but like an off-brand one, because I didn't want an iPhone. I prefer Androids, but also like just like the difference in price, like put me off. I didn't want to spend that much. So how do you tell the difference between me, who doesn't buy an iPhone because I don't think it's worth it, and somebody else who really wants it but doesn't buy it because they can't afford it?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it stands as a good question because, again, our discipline doesn't know how to do that. In fact, our discipline has decided that, like, if we talk about something like healthcare, for example, right? My son, he just got back from the Czech Republic, and over there, he had an issue with his toe, and for various reasons, he didn't have health insurance. I won't go into the details, which is funny because over there they have socialized medicine, so everybody's supposed to have health insurance, but he didn't. So he'd been living over there, and anyway, it got a little bit complicated. But he's not a Czech citizen; he's a U.S. citizen, and so he came home, and he was able to get his toe taken care of. But if it's kind of like one thing to say like, well, he had this medical issue, and over there he didn't want to pay what he would have had to pay to get it taken care of because he didn't have health insurance, and he got back here, and he was able to have health insurance here, so it was cheaper, and he was able to get his copay and get it taken care of. So when we talk about things like medicine, access to food, and things that seem like, and I'll just put again in air quotes, necessity, it's difficult to think of those things in the same way that you think about iPhones. But the question there seems even more kind of pressing, right? That you have people that are homeless in a market economy. You have people and it's to lesser extent today, but you still have some people that don't have health insurance, don't have regular access to healthcare in a market economy. And to say that the reason why they don't have access to those things is because they don't value them as much as other people, right? I don't know if you wanted to add anything else. Do you have any other observations? I'm just pointing out what's going on.
Wait, Professor, so is this about elasticity, or just like regular shifting and movement along demand and supply that you?
Well, yeah, actually neither. What I'm kind of getting to is that the way that we in economics measure value is with something we call the willingness to pay for a good. And so, but before I tell you that every good goes to the consumer that values it the most, I'm going to substitute and say every good goes to the consumer that has the highest willingness to pay for the good. I don't want to subtly deceive you and make you think that, oh, now that we're using willingness to pay, like everything's okay, there's no problems here. It's just that willingness to pay is something we can measure, and it helps differentiate between consumers like me who don't buy iPhones because I don't want them, and people that buy iPhones because they like them. But so it doesn't have to do with shifting or elasticity yet. So I'll go back. Madison, do you have any comments or questions?
I was just thinking like the way it's like set up, like would it be different if it wasn't in a market? Like, you know how you said the other country has like free healthcare for everyone? Like this is just because we're in this kind of market, right? It's not because we're like, because the other countries are all like pro like the person in need, and we're like more like the money. If that
Well,
makes sense.
yeah, I mean, you can think about it that way, and that's fine. And I think it's good to keep those questions in the back of your head. But I just want to be clear about one thing, is that once we get rolling here, and we're just about ready to roll, because I'm going to stop talking about this stuff as we move forward in our other lectures, and I may mention it occasionally. But basically, what our discipline is saying is we're going to show you that competitive markets are efficient. We're going to define efficiency using this definition of general economic efficiency, and more specifically, we're going to talk about allocative efficiency and productive efficiency. And we are going to say, well, look, this is efficient in terms of like who gets what in society, this question here, right? Because the person that's going to get a good in a market economy is the person that values it the most. But our definition of value based on willingness to pay has all of this kind of built-in stuff. And most economists would tell you that if you look at some place that has universal healthcare, right, that the result is going to be inefficiency because they're not using the market to guide who gets healthcare and who doesn't. Now, here's a good question for you, Madison. In economies where they have universal healthcare, where healthcare is, quote, free, and that just means people pay for it through taxes and not directly, right, out of their own checking account, right? So it's not really free. Are there people that don't get healthcare?
The people that can't afford it on their own.
Well, no. There are people in, like, I don't know if you know anybody that lives in any of these other countries, like my son did, but we also have he has friends and relatives in England, which has universal health care too, and there are people there that don't get health care even though they have health insurance. And do you know why?
I don't think so.
It's because there's limited capacity. So for example, my son's cousin in England, she was skiing and she tore the ligaments in her knee. And they told her, okay, you know, you don't pay anything. You go to the doctor. The doctor says, oh, you got torn ligaments. We're going to give you a brace, but she needed surgery. And they said, okay, we'll put you on the list for surgery. You're going to have to wait 6 months to get surgery. So, and there are people there that, you know, need various types of cancer treatment and stuff like that. And it's all what you would call triage care, you know, like, oh, I'm going to look at you. I'm going to look at how long you've been waiting, and I'm going to look at how bad your situation is. Sorry, you can't ski for the rest of the season, or you're not going to be able to ski next year. We'll put you on the list to get your surgery, and when your time comes, you'll get it, right? If your leg hasn't already healed enough and you still want it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So his cousin actually, so one of the things that's a little bit nice in England is they do have a private and a public healthcare system. You can go public and wait and get it for free, meaning like no copay, it's all paid for by your taxes. But you can also pay privately for a doctor to see you sooner. So his cousin's parents paid so their daughter could get surgery on her knee and not have to wait 6 months. But if, you know, she couldn't afford it, again, whatever that really means, that would mean that she would just wait. Okay, so we're starting to run out of time, and I want to do something a little bit more concrete. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a demand curve for you. Okay, and I want to point out. So this is, I just assigned you all the second homework off of Ignithium. And if you all haven't signed up for Ignithium and subscribed, then you're going to need to do that really soon in order to have access to all the materials you need. And since, you know, our drop date is here. So this is a demand curve, and we label price here. And on Ignithium, this is price, but we're a little bit more specific. And since this is just demand, I'm going to call that PB, the price that the buyer would pay for the good. And this I'm going to label right now, because it's just demand, is QB, quantity demanded by the buyer. One of the first things that you'll notice is that we have this vertical intercept here. And that vertical intercept, we call it the buyer's limit price. You also might see reservation price. And you might also hear the term choke price. It's the price at which, if the buyer ends up seeing any price higher than this, their quantity demanded drops to 0. They don't want to buy the good anymore. Okay. And if we look at a particular quantity, let's say this is Q is equal to 5, right? Like the 5th unit. And I'll put a little dot here. Okay. Then we go ahead and we look at the height of the demand curve there. Now, notice that's going to be measured in terms of a particular dollar value on the y-axis. This dollar value is the willingness to pay for the 5th unit for this consumer. Okay, so dollar value is equal to the willingness to pay. Now, I want to point out also that willingness to pay actually stands for the maximum, and I'll put in parentheses marginal, because it is the maximum marginal willingness to pay. What do we mean by that? And since I was chatting with you, Madison, I'm just going to chat with you since we just have a few minutes left. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So this is some dollar amount, and we could pretend, let's just say it's $10. Okay. And so let's think about this language, willingness to pay. So the consumer is willing to pay at most $10 for this 5th, call it a candy bar, their 5th candy bar, nice candy bar. Maybe it's Godiva chocolate or something, right? They're willing to pay at most $10 for it. So what does that mean? Well, if we take the price above 10, let's say 11, would they still buy that 5th candy bar?
No, they're not willing to pay that much.
Yeah, right. It's above their maximum willingness to pay, and so their quantity demanded would drop, right? They would be at a different point on their demand curve. But would they be willing to pay, let's say, $8 for that 5th candy bar?
Yeah.
Yeah, and $5 and $3 and $2. So the point is that the point on the demand curve here is their maximum willingness to pay. So you'll see willingness to pay a lot. And implicitly, willingness to pay always refers to the maximum marginal willingness to pay, even though we're just going to say willingness to pay. And that's part of the jargon in our discipline, because we're all economists and we know we can use shorthand with each other. But if you ever get like confused, you might hear me say, well, the height of the demand curve is the willingness to pay of the consumer that buys that unit of the good. Just remember this discussion and don't get confused by willingness to pay, because I'm not going to always say maximum marginal willingness to pay. I'm just going to say willingness to pay because that's what we do in our discipline. And the other thing that I want to kind of finish off with is that when we say that every good goes to the consumer that values it the most, we're saying that every good goes to the consumer with the, and I'm going to put it here in parentheses if I can get it to go for me, the highest willingness to pay. Okay, that's what we mean. Every good goes to the consumer with the highest willingness to pay in a market. Now, the last thing I'm going to say, we got like 30 seconds left, is that there's a difference, Madison, between willingness and ability to pay. And when we talk about affordability, we're talking about ability to pay, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's important to remind ourselves that we kind of have this sort of blind spot in our discipline. Our discipline ignores ability to pay. We don't differentiate between consumers like me that don't buy an iPhone because I don't want one, and consumers that don't buy one and aren't willing to pay for one because they literally don't have the ability and they can't afford to pay it. Those folks get lumped together into the, well, you know, they just don't want the good. They have a lower willingness to pay than somebody else that buys it. But if you pay attention, there are discussions in our discipline about, well, you know, some of those folks, the reason they're not showing up on the demand curve is not because they're not willing to pay it, but because they don't have the ability to pay. Okay. So they're important questions. They're just things that have not really been worked out in our discipline. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to hang out for a minute. If anybody has any like other questions, I will say one thing, and let me say this.